Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, while the debate goes on in Connecticut as to which town had the first English settlers, Windsor or Wethersfield, there can be no argument over which one had the first volunteer fire departments. In fact, Wethersfield has the oldest continuously operating volunteer fire department, not just in Connecticut, not just in New England, but in the entire country. And let me tell you, the techniques for fighting fires over the centuries are simply incredible. Well, our guest today to discuss this is none other than the chief of the Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department, Brian Schroll. And he's going to be along in just a moment with fabulous and interesting stories. This week's trivia question: you've heard of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Well, which Connecticut town was the Dow of Dow Jones born in? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients. And they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Fire. It is so dangerous that the Supreme Court has used it to define our very First Amendment freedom of speech rights. In an infamous ruling decades ago, they said speech is not absolutely protected. And they used as an example that it would not be protected if somebody went into a crowded movie theater and shouted fire when there isn't any. The resulting stampede, of course, would be contrary to public safety. Well, fire's been with us since caveman days, and in colonial times it was used to cook and heat houses all the time, houses that were made of highly combustible material. The science of fighting fires has advanced markedly over the centuries, and yet it's fascinating to turn back the clock and remember what it was like to fight a fire in the olden days. And for that, we're turning today to the Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department. It is the oldest continuously operating volunteer fire department in Connecticut and beyond, as you're going to hear. Chief Brian Schroll is here to tell us what it was like fighting fires back then and to tell us the story of this fabled Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department. Brian, I read somewhere as I was getting ready to do this interview with you, from the old days, very simplified, oversimplified version of the fact that wood burns and water puts out the fire. And those are the basic tenets of firefighting back in the 1600s and 1700s. Obviously, today, technology is advanced. You have, thankfully, a lot more tools to fight these incredibly dangerous fires, which I'm not sure people get the full extent of just how dangerous your job is. But let's go back to those 1600 days, right? They're building their houses with wood. They're building their stores with wood. They're usually building them pretty close together. And tell us what it was like back then.
Well, way back when, like you mentioned, everything was built out of wood, hay, grass, straw. And of course, being a farming community, there was a lot of open farmland, a lot of woods, a lot of trees, a lot of underbrush. So common things that we ran into many years ago was really just, wood-based type fires. But of course, like you said, the issue with fires at the time was water. There were no hydrants at the time. There were no fire apparatus at the time. There were basically buckets. Buckets you carried water to throw at the fire.
I read in, I guess it was way back in 1690, we think we don't like regulations today from the government, but back in 1690, I guess in Wethersfield, you had to have a fire bucket ready at your house and at your store. And the town voted way back then to buy some ladders. And I always thought they were wooden buckets, but they were leather. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the leather buckets, obviously, because of the rigidity of the leather, they lasted a long time. Of course, animals and cows and, where leather comes from. But the wood at the time, there were not a lot of manufacturers, sawmills, not the technology that they have now to make wooden ladders, but the leather buckets, they held up to the elements. They were outside all the time. They carried the water and put up with the abuse.
As I was doing my research, I kept going back to the fact that Wethersfield, being the first in Connecticut like this, really had to come up with new novel ways to fight fire as it continued to grow. And, in the 1700s, you had chimney viewers and a town watchman. They paid $1 a night. Tell me what kind of role these people would play.
They patrolled the area just looking for fires. And it was really like a town watchman. That's how people got notified of fires at the time, especially at night when people were sleeping.
I love this one regulation in 1797, way back when, where there were monthly inspections mandated at every structure. And if you had your house, they had to come in and check out your chimney and check out the house. Can you imagine doing that today?
Oh, no, it's crazy. I mean, it even gets down to the point years ago, you had to subscribe to an insurance company. And if you didn't have their plaque on their house, they wouldn't fight your fire because you were not covered by insurance.
Wow, I never heard that story. Let's go back and explain to people something that they probably take for granted. I know I certainly did until I started reading up on it. Bucket brigades. Now, these are incredible, and I want to use Wethersfield as an example. So, back in the day, right, there was a church bell that would ring, and if it wasn't Sunday morning, that meant there was a fire. And I guess it started off with people throwing their leather buckets into the street. Can you pick it up from there?
Like going back to what you said, everybody was required back then to have a leather bucket. And that's what would happen is they get notified and they would ring the church bells. Back then, everything revolved around the church in the center of town. So it's not like the 13 square miles we had now. We had blocks of stores and businesses and houses in that area. So the church bells would toll, and people that put together the early semblance of firemen would run towards the scenes, and these people that lived there would throw their buckets out the street. So the firemen would pick them up and then run towards wherever the fire was.
To start this bucket brigade, they had to go to the source of the water, as you were talking about earlier. There were no hydrants, but there was a community well and a community pump. And I guess that was in Wethersfield at the corner of Main and Marsh. So they would all start there?
Yep, correct. That's why the church is at Main Street and Marsh Street, and the church in the water hole was there. And that was probably the main reason that they started the fire brigade in the church itself, because everything was centralized right there.
So now they would then string a bunch of people from the well out to the fire. And I guess there was no bias about how old you were or whether you were male or female. You were on that line.
Didn't matter. If you could hold a bucket and throw water, you were you were a firefighter.
The other thing I didn't know was the origin of the term hook and ladder. Could you explain the origin of hook and ladder, why hook is so important?
Basically, by the time you got to a residence that might have been on fire, they kind of just wrote it off because it's a matter of a 3-gallon bucket up against a raging house fire. So the term hook and ladder came from is that we had these long hooks where they would pull down the house to stop it from burning so it wouldn't spread to the neighboring structures.
Now, when you talk about the technology that has over the years gotten better and better, it's fascinating to go back and see that in 1858, right? So this is right before the Civil War, just to put people's minds in context. The Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department had bought off the city of Hartford a machine called the Neptune. And this was one of those that you see every so often, a human-drawn cart that went to the scene and then had pumping arms. Can you explain how this thing worked?
Well, what happened is it would have to be pulled to a fire, and it was very labor intensive, and it took quite a few men to pull this, and it carried water, and it had a little like a piston type pump on it, operated by manpower. So you would have these big levers on the side that you would pump up and down, and it would pull the water from the tank and shoot it out the nozzle that was mounted on top of the Neptune.
And it would spray, I guess, maybe as far as 70 feet?
Yeah, if you had the right amount of manpower, you could probably throw 70 feet of water. But of course, it was very labor intensive.
The next step up, which was interesting because Wethersfield, after all, is on the Connecticut River, and sometimes you got to fight a fire from the river, which is ironic enough because of the water in the river. But you bought for a mere $50 at the time in the 1950s something called the Duck.
Back in the 50s, the Duck is basically arms carriers from the military. The military invented them. At the time, we didn't have a marine type unit for the Connecticut River. So we found a surplus duck, as they call it, and you could drive down the road and then drive right into the water. And then we did water rescues and things like that because of the Wethersfield Cove and because of the Connecticut River.
Now, if you move to 1915, this must have seemed like the pinnacle of technology for you guys because you buy an old-fashioned Republic pumper, but it wasn't old-fashioned then. It was the first time that you had a gasoline engine and solid rubber tires. You could actually drive this thing to a fire. What did that mean to the department?
That was like a Cadillac limousine in today's terms. You didn't have to have 40 men pulling it. You didn't have to have the manpower to pump it. It was gasoline powered, and you get to drive it to wherever the incident is. There was no more running. There was no more carrying things. So you had the opportunity to get there in a more timely fashion.
Now, you must have been extremely proud as a department in 1964 because you became the first volunteer fire company in Connecticut to buy and operate a 100-foot aerial ladder.
Everybody thought we were crazy at the time. The foresight of some of the past fire chiefs, they said, they were looking to build a 6-story apartment building on the west end of town. Previous fire chief said, well, I need a 100-foot ladder. And many of the old farming communities that surrounded us said, you guys are crazy, too big, this, that, the other thing. And once we got it, we weren't too crazy anymore because everybody around us kept calling for it. And up until 1997, it served us very well.
Now, another thing, technologically speaking, that probably people just take for granted, the whole idea of what telephone service and even shortwave radio did. I mean, it made me go back to the old days and realize that if you needed backup support from another town, somebody had to ride their horse over and tell them that you needed help. And, whereas finally with phone service, not only did you not have to have a night watchman out looking for fires in the sky? People could call a fire department. I mean, this just revolutionized how you could approach firefighting.
Absolutely. If you look back into some of the older pictures, and even nowadays, even at parades, you'll see the chiefs be leading the parade with a hand trumpet in their hand that's full of flowers. That was the original way to communicate on the fire ground, that the chiefs would speak into these speaking trumpets. Of course, then the invention of telephones, two-way radios, it was cutting edge technology to be able to pick up a phone, or at that time it would ring into the prison in Wethersfield, and they would dispatch the fire department from a phone call.
When you talk about the actual history of fires in Wethersfield, as good as the fire department was, occasionally these things get ahead of you. And in, I guess, 1834, there was a devastating fire in downtown Wethersfield. Can you tell us about that?
We had a catastrophic fires in Wethersfield where we lost blocks of buildings because the technology back then, leather buckets, hooks and ladders, and the progression of fire, it really just burned to the places where it had nothing left to burn anymore because of the advanced stages of the fire.
One of the things that people may not know about Wethersfield is that in all the colonies in New England, the very first ship that was built was called the Trial in the 1600s, and it went out of Wethersfield, down the Connecticut River, out to the West Indies, and its number one export was lumber. So in 1955, I suppose it's no surprise that the Wethersfield Lumber Company went up in smoke, and I guess there were just thousands and thousands of feet of cut boards at total loss.
It was blocks and blocks long, this lumber company. And when I kind of remember of it was in the heat of the summer. Technology at the time, it was advancing with fire apparatus, but open lumber, dried lumber in an open space on a windy day, it was like a perfect storm, and it just went from one block to the other and destroyed the whole lumber company.
In the 1960s, you got a call that I'm sure was very interesting because it was requiring you to take the temperature down a little bit, but it wasn't because of a fire, it was prison riots. Could you tell us about that?
Of course, we had the major state prison in our community, and sometimes the inmates got a little unruly. There was riots held within the prisons, and to quell some of the prisoners as they got out of hand, where the guards became overwhelmed, the fire department would bring the hoses into the compound and kind of hand them over to the prison guards, and that's what quelled some of the riots as they were happening.
I wanted to save the best for last, which is 1803. So this is the date where the General Assembly in Hartford approves the Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department's request for a formal charter. That made the Volunteer Fire Department in Wethersfield the first one in the state of Connecticut, and what I read is correct, also in New England. That's a heck of an achievement.
Yes, May 12th, actually, of 1803. Of course, we have some history going way back up to the 1600s, but we weren't officially recognized as the volunteer fire department until 1803. To this day, from what I understand of it, we are the oldest continuous volunteer fire department in New England and possibly the United States. And that is in a continuous existence. There are some older fire departments that have turned to career fire departments, like City of Boston, City of New York, but we are the oldest continuous volunteer as of today.
That's absolutely fascinating. And, I want to wrap up with the whole idea of recruitment. I don't know that the public truly appreciates what a volunteer fire department goes through in terms of recruitment. These are people like yourself. I mean, you work full-time at Hartford Hospital in the fire safety office, and which is very commendable and lucky for them. But people have to then drop their jobs when there's an alarm, go and fight a fire. Tell us how challenging that is.
Well, it's challenging, during the day because, Wethersfield nowadays is really kind of a bedroom community. A lot of the businesses in town years ago that would share their employees with the fire department have either moved out or, people have retired or things like that. So being a bedroom community, our daytime staffing is limited. It's a delay of getting our people back into town. So recruitment and retention is obviously an issue throughout the United States.
Well, back in the 1800s, to sweeten the pot for recruits, firefighters in Wethersfield got an exemption from having to pay the poll tax for schools, and they could drive toll-free on the Hartford to Middletown Highway. Today, they use a point system, with 1 point granted for each time you respond to a call, and more points for training, so your time can at least be partially reimbursed. And Chief Schroll says the pride factor of being in the oldest continuously operating volunteer fire department is something the staff feels and gives them a certain amount of bragging rights. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. It's one of the great community-minded and spirited local organizations that you can support, your volunteer fire department. They're there for you, and hopefully you can return the favor and be there for them. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Brian Schroll, Chief of the Wethersfield Volunteer Fire Department, the oldest continuously operating volunteer fire department in the nation. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, you've heard of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Well, which Connecticut town was the Dow of Dow Jones born in? The answer is Sterling, Connecticut, right on the Rhode Island border. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, Charles Dow started the Wall Street Journal newspaper, and he was half of the Dow Jones team that began the stock market tracking phenomenon. We're going to have his story next week. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.